Good evening, everybody. Um, Thanks for joining us on a rather sultry night. Um, I know it's a rather balmy 80 in Plymouth. I'm assuming it's similar to that in Falmouth. A couple things before we get going tonight. I was hoping you, first of all, I have to apologize to our speaker time, Mr. Strauss. I put on as you recall, we had an earlier talk with on John Marshall, and I put that author on instead of tonight. So I was like, "Go, that was dumb." So I have to apologize that happened a month ago. So, and also, if you were looking at the PowerPoint, you might have noticed that on July 27th, we actually have what's called a hybrid talk. We've had people asking, when are we going to get back to doing in-person things? I said, well, I want to make sure everything is a-okay first. So on July 27th, it'll be our first foray back into at least in-person things. So we're going to do, if you're in the Falmouth area and if you want to attend in person, you can. If you want to watch on Zoom, you can. So that's going to be my little lab rat experiment. So we're going to see how that one's going to work out. As you know, all our talks are brought to us by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. All the books on our Safer at Home series are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope that you visit the local establishment. And our speaker tonight, Robert Strauss, has worked at Sports Illustrated, Philadelphia Daily News. Is an adjunct professor over the University of Pennsylvania in the English department. And if the name seems familiar, you may recall he's actually been to Falmouth before. He wrote a book called The Worst President Ever. And so when he emailed me and said he's got a new book out, I said, well, he already knows his way to Falmouth, so it didn't take a lot of convincing of me. And so would you welcome our speaker tonight, Robert Strauss?
Hi, how you doing up there in Falmouth? I'm actually outside of Philadelphia, in New Jersey, speaking to you. So I'm here in my living room, just like I guess Fred Rogers. So what I want to talk to you about is this. I love American history. If I could pan around my room, which I'm not going to do. Most of these books were in my father's library. My father was a crazed American history nut, and we went to a bunch of places where I always had to read the signs and know a little bit about where we were going. And since I lived outside of Philadelphia, of course, I learned a lot about the American Revolution history, such as it was when I was a little boy. I became a journalist, and somewhere late in life, I decided to write American history. And fortunately, well, the way I look at American history, let me just tell you this, is that it's a way to be entertained. I mean, Ken Burns says, history has the word story in it. So I like to tell the stories that maybe encourage you to look up your own stories. And they're not the story, I have my book here, and there's I don't have to tell you that there's a portrait of John Marshall in it with his stuffed shirt, and a collar, and I'm sure he sat for it, and he was happy that somebody drew it, but it's not him. This guy that you see in this sort of staid, half smiling portrait is not the John Marshall that I've come to know. John Marshall was one of the great party givers of revolutionary and post-revolutionary time. He like many of the founding fathers, he loved Madeira. Now, I don't know if his Madeira came that you would be offered a glass of something. There was a joke about it, and when he became Supreme Court Chief Justice, he continued this, and he said, you can only drink when it rains. So periodically he would have a lesser justice or a clerk or somebody, there were no clerks at that point, open the window. He said, so what's the weather? And they would say, Mr. Chief Justice, the sun's shining, looks great outside. Says, well, it's got to be raining somewhere, and he was sort of I guess he was the Jimmy Buffett of Supreme Court justices. So given that, and going back to my other book about James Buchanan, which was worst president period ever. I looked at my editor when he wanted that as the title, and I said, oh my God, how juvenile. But let me tell you, anytime I went someplace, somebody had something to say, because the title bespoke to them something. Luckily, it's gotten me into like the New York Times called me a couple of weeks ago because they were talking to other historians who were, of course, making Donald Trump the worst president ever. Doris Kearns Goodwin and Sean Wilentz of Princeton, and of course she asked me, well, what do you think? I said, well, I still think, my God, there's neither of these people started the Civil War or influenced the Dred Scott decision. So meanwhile, the story was very serious until it gets to the end and has some quote by me saying, well, he really was a nice guy and he gave a lot of good parties. So, does that make James Buchanan the worst president because he's had good qualities? I don't know. But I looked at Buchanan the same way as I looked at Marshall. Marshall was, if Ron Chernow had picked up a biography of John Marshall instead of one about Alexander Hamilton, the musical would have been Marshall with 3 exclamation points. He was sort of the Zelig. I don't know if you know, Zelig was a movie by Woody Allen, and Zelig was a character who appeared everywhere. So he was sort of the Zelig of the founders. Less well known, even though at the time he was there was a long period where he was sort of the head of the Federalist Party as it petered out. He was a hero to some, and he was a rising star. I mean, you can't get better than the Supreme Court unless you're president. But let me tell you something else, though. It was under. Let's face it. We think they lived in a junior version of our country. Well, in the 1800 census, there were only 5 towns that had more than 10,000 people in the whole United States. This is a quarter century after the Declaration here. America was like a gold rush. People came from all over the world to come here to have their piece of land. But there was only Philadelphia and New York with about 40, 50,000 people. And then Baltimore, Boston, and Charleston with more than 10. The largest city in New Jersey was this place that is now by me, Evesham, New Jersey. If any of you came from South Jersey, you would know it. But it had like 4,000 people, and it was the largest city in New Jersey in 1800. And to just go back a little bit further, in the 1790 census, if you look in there, there were about 3 million people living in the United States. Now you take out your women, because of course women couldn't be a founding father. You take out slaves, and frankly, most other Black people, Indians or Native Americans. You take out them because they quasi-citizens, but not really. And then you take out young people because, of course, they can't be founders yet. So in the United States at the time, there were the white population over 16 of men was about 750,000 people. Well, you take out some more, the 16 and under a little bit, 16 over a little bit. So let's say you have a quarter, let's say we'll go back to 750,000. You have 250,000 people who could be a founder. Excuse me, 750,000 people who could be a founder. Well, this is a big country. At that point, it goes from New Hampshire to Georgia. That's not a, per square mile, I don't know what it is, but not many. And then you take Virginia. Virginia had 21% of the population of the United States. We've gone from a Virginia-centric country to a New York-centric country at some point. New York, and now I believe we are a California-centric country. They're the most important state, or the most populous state in any case. But that's a lot of people. You think about who the founders were. I mean, there were Virginians: Patrick Henry, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, my friend John Marshall. It takes up a considerable portion of that founding consensus. In fact, write the Declaration of Independence is that Jefferson should write it because he was from Virginia, and perhaps they wouldn't believe it unless it came from a Virginian. Just like the infrastructure bill won't be anything until Joe Manchin says it is, right? So in this case, Virginians were looked upon as we got to have them. And that sort of goes on to anyway. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Marshall and how he became a founder. And this is a tale that should be told to your children, so that they can become the same thing in the same way. Marshall's father was Thomas Marshall, was a surveyor. That's sort of what his job was, and he became friendly, at least somewhat friends, with George Washington. Now, Washington lived a little bit east of what Washington D.C. would be today, and Marshall lived maybe 50, 70 miles west, but that was really a hard 50 or 70 miles to get to. Well, there was no, there was Alexandria, a little town there where Washington D.C. would eventually be. And anyway, but Washington, he surveyed that part of the country a bit, and as you may imagine, they're looking for a rich person, and who knows what they want, 10,000 acres. So if they get 10,000 acres of something, of some area, perhaps the pay would be in land, and Thomas Marshall would get 100 acres, or Washington would get 150 acres, since he was already a military hero and somebody of fame. So they built up their cache of land. So we'll jump to the time Marshall was born in the 1750s. My Marshall, John Marshall, and Washington, becomes the general, and so the two marshals decide, we're going to go to war with our friend George, right? So they go to a nearby town, and they sort of set up, and my guy John Marshall is in his late teens, but his father has taught him soldiery. Now, by the way, John Marshall went to 1 year of school. He went when he was about 10. His father sent him to a boarding school where he met James Monroe, not exactly a friend of his later on, but a friend then. And that was it. That was it. There were ministers who would come through, and for a month they'd teach you a little bit of whatever it was, Latin or whatever your father wanted. Marshall did have a friend, Lord Fairfax, who was the owner, so to speak, of a lot of land in Virginia, and a colonial governor. And he opened his library to Marshall, and so young John was well studied, but he didn't go to school. Anyway, he's now ready to go to war, and he gets a little band of people around him, young people, and not very big, 10, 12 people, and he becomes a lieutenant. How does he become a lieutenant? Because he says he's a lieutenant. It's about what he should be if he's ahead of these 12 people. It's very free for him, our early days, and because who's around to tell you no? Patrick Henry's the governor. He wants people to go to war, and so he doesn't have to exactly go commission every last little battalion, but he tells them where to go. So they go up and meet Washington, and they fight. Marshall is fighting in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania, and he gets to be. They get to Valley Forge eventually. Now, Valley Forge, our vision of Valley Forge is a guy with sort of paper shoes and no clothes and shivering and that sort of thing. Now, Valley, it was cold. It was the winter in Pennsylvania. It wasn't exactly the tropical, but most of the people who died in Valley Forge died not of cold and that, but of disease. They in fact, if you go to Valley Forge today, you can see them. They built huts before the winter ever came. It wasn't glorious, but they were mostly covered. Most of the problem of disease had to do with basically latrines not being put in the right place and not at the bottom of these hills. By the way, Valley Forge is not a valley. It would be pretty stupid of Washington to come out and put everybody in a valley, overlooking Philadelphia, not overlooking Philadelphia, overlooking the bottom of a hill that overlooks Philadelphia. So most of Valley Forge is higher land. There is a valley within it. There's a stream that runs through it, but that's about the valley in Valley Forge. Anyway, we're in Valley Forge now, and Marshall has his little semi-commission, and he has drawn the favor of Washington. And by the way, he is probably Washington's greatest acolyte in his life, as you'll see later on. In any case, Marshall takes it upon himself to cheer the troops. This is his thing. He's a very cheery kind of guy, and he for Valley Forge. There's about 12,000 soldiers there, and whatever his group is, he makes games and contests for them. He was a fast runner growing up. His mother used to make him white stockings, and he'd wear his white stockings all the time, and he'd run in them. And since he won most of the races, most people would see his heels, so they called him Silver Heels, based on his mother's white stockings. There was a diary entry that I saw that said that he could jump over a stick or a bar resting on the heads of two soldiers. So that's pretty good. I mean, it's not the Olympics. I mean, it's not 8 feet, but it's 6 anyway, right? And so he was sort of the Bruce Jenner of our colonial troops. In any case, so they survived Valley Forge, as you may know, and sort of win the war, but later on. But Marshall's commission is done, and he in 1778, 79. And so where does he go? Well, his father's got a little commission in Yorktown. So he says, all right, I'll go to Yorktown. It's still Virginia. We're near where I grew up. And as he's getting to Yorktown, word comes out that this young soldier hero is coming to Yorktown. And, many of the men have been taken away by war, not taken away, but have left, and there aren't that many men in town. And so this family with 3 teenage daughters, the Amblins, decide they're going to have a little party, or well, better than a little party, invite everybody and meet the new war hero. So the three Amblin girls, and the youngest is 13, Polly Amblin, and she decides that she's going to catch this guy. She's going to be his date or whatever she's going to be. Well, Marshall finally comes to the door, and he's not Christopher Reeve in Superman. He's a guy wearing a fringed jacket, much like John Voight in Midnight Cowboy. He's wearing a hat that he thought would be neat for a soldier, but it's sort of a off the side English hat. He's wearing boots, which are just boots, and he's slim and gawky, and he's very polite and nice, but his accent is all slumming, I suppose, and so he's not the vision that the girls thought he was going to be. But the young 13-year-old Polly Amblin still likes him, still thinks he's attracts him, and at this party he is smitten. John Marshall is smitten with this 13-year-old, and he's in his early 20s, right? So he decides to stay in Yorktown, and in nearby in Williamsburg is William and Mary College, and at William and Mary College, George Wythe is the great legal scholar. People rush to go study under him. Thomas Jefferson did. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, was Marshall's second cousin. In any case, so Marshall decides to stay in town, goes over to take some lectures from George Wythe, and we find out when we look at his notebooks for this, it's like an 8th grade girl of today. It's got P.A. and J.M., Polly and John, John Marshall and Polly Amblin. Well, I mean, it comes down to us that he, like I say, is smitten. But at some point, her father, Joaquin Amblin, gets a job in Richmond, the new capital of Virginia, and they're ready to go off. Well, and so they go off, and Marshall says, well, my work's done here. And after 5 weeks of law school, he decides he's going to amble off to Richmond to his girlfriend or whatever she is at this point. And he applies to Thomas Jefferson, his second cousin, who was the governor of Virginia, and he gets to more or less his law license. So he gets to Virginia and he starts trying to get cases, and they're little cases. In Richmond, well, in any case, he becomes one of the great lawyers in Richmond over the next year or so. Well, big deal. Richmond has 2,700 people. This is how a founder gets to be a founder. He gets to be a big fish in America. That's not such a small pond. But it's pond-like over there in Richmond because there are no paved streets. This is the capital. Across from the courthouse, so to speak, or whatever municipal building there is the hall for the state legislature, which is more or less a warehouse, like a nicer warehouse, like a new Amazon one. In the middle is this little stream, which of course contains rather fetid material at times. And you have to jump over it to get from one place to the other. But Marshall builds a house there. But in any case, Marshall rises up through he becomes a state legislator. Eventually he gets elected to Congress. He's a Federalist. He's decided to put in with the Federalists, not with the Jeffersonians, a lot of whom are in Virginia. But before this, of course, they have to ratify the Constitution to become a state. Okay, so the Constitution says there has to be 9 states that ratify it, and then it'll be a nation. Well, the first 9 states don't include Virginia, New York, or New York. Good luck with a country without Virginia and New York. As if you watch, if you've seen Hamilton, when King George finds out that John Adams is going to be the next president, he says, "John Adams, good luck." Well, that's the same way here. You think you've got this country, you think everybody's all organized, but Virginia hasn't decided whether it wants to throw in with the rest of the states. Patrick Henry, the great orator of his time, and certainly well connected man, does not want this, and he takes up that side. Well, John Marshall decides that through his dealings with his mentor, George Wythe, he's going to take up the other side and convince the delegates to this constitutional convention in Virginia to become a state, to throw in with the Union. And he does, by 10 votes of more than 140. It barely happens that Virginia becomes a state. And then right after that, New York becomes a state. But it wasn't happening. Our country was on this precipice, and John Marshall essentially pushed it over. And that's where he got his first larger amount of fame. Outdueling, in a sense, Patrick Henry. But in all deference to him, he also had John Marshall had James Madison on his side too. It was back in his time of writing the Federalist Papers, so he was still of that ilk, not having turned to being a Jeffersonian yet. So the country gets started. Marshall has all these still offices in Virginia. He does, as I said, become a congressman for a while. And through Washington's term, he offers Marshall many things that Marshall continues to say no to. He'd rather be representing his state, Virginia, rather than being Attorney General, which he was offered. He doesn't want either of them. But eventually, he stays in Washington for a while, and he becomes a great friend of John Adams. Adams trusts him with a lot of things. He goes. One of the things that Marshall is he goes off to France and he becomes part of the XYZ affair, where Talleyrand, the prime minister, says, "Well, you can see the king, or you can see the prime minister, or any of these people, but you've got to give me some money." And three other young ministers come to Marshall and his 2 cohorts there, and say the same thing. And Marshall says, "Hell with it, we're going home." So he goes home, and he gets to Philadelphia, and there's a huge parade for him, the biggest parade that there had been until that time, because he wouldn't sell out America. Even the Francophiles were not into that, and it was called the XYZ affair. Those were what the other young men were called. So he's the hero of the XYZ affair. Eventually, Adams appoints him. Finally, finds a job that he likes: Secretary of State. Adams finds out that Hamilton is controlling his cabinet. He throws 3 of them out, and Marshall replaces the one that becomes Secretary of State. So he's really got things going, right? I mean, he's like, he goes to a party, he meets somebody, they go up to Richmond, and suddenly he becomes a founding father, right? It turns out that Marshall's father-in-law married, in other words, his mother-in-law, was one of Thomas Jefferson's she was a heartthrob to him. And he had proposed to her, and she refused him for the man who became Marshall's father-in-law. Well, that then continues to exacerbate a split between the second cousins, Jefferson and Marshall. Marshall, of course, like I said, is a Federalist. Jefferson is a Jeffersonian. He's a Republican Democrat. That was the long name of the party, but they mostly called themselves Republicans. Well, much like the people on the right who want to aggravate Democrats, they call it the Democrat Party, not the Democratic Party, right? So they know that, I'm sure most of these people know that aggravates the people on the other side. Well, Marshall did the same thing. He would, instead of calling the Jeffersonians Republicans, he called them Democrats, because that made them sound like people who were into the French Revolution, the part of the French Revolution where everybody's heads were being chopped off. So they were, radicals in the face of the writings of that time. And please, don't think that we live in this unique generation where the people are at odds with each other. 1800 was much worse. Washington had gone. In fact, Washington dies on December 14th, 1799. Doesn't quite make it to 1800. He had a chill and comes back to the house. The doctors come and they bleed him. One of the great medical miracles that Benjamin Rush advocated, the great doctor in Philadelphia that founded the first hospital. But it really wasn't a very successful thing, and Washington dies. The word was, the word gets sent to John Marshall from Mount Vernon. So Washington, like I said, died on the 14th. The morning of the 18th, 4 days later, 3.5 days later, word gets to Philadelphia that the great George Washington had died. It shows you what the time and space thing was in those days. Now, there is no I-95 to go up. There is not even a Washington, D.C. to go through. So this rider has to make his way through this wooded area, constantly wooded, not exactly, with a AAA triptych or GPS. He has to change horses, clearly. He has to feed himself, he has to rest, and it takes him 3.5 days to get to Philadelphia. Pretty much a 2.5 to 3 hour drive today. You sort of wonder, how did the people in New Hampshire know what the people in South Carolina were thinking? When Madison writes to Jefferson in France, and it takes him 2 months to get this note, what is Jefferson thinking? He doesn't even really know what's going on anymore. So the insurmountable, I would say, is obviously surmounted, problem of time and space in that era to have forged our country is pretty amazing, to tell you the truth. But in any way, now I'm going to go back to my friend Marshall. So as Secretary of State, he is ministering. He's the leading. Secretary of State was more like Chief of Staff then. I mean, they obviously deal with foreign affairs, but they deal with the president. He's the head man of the cabinet, right? at the time, Marshall had 13 employees in the State Department. They were busy bees, obviously, but Marshall then, well, one of the things that happens is John Adams does not like the weather in Washington. He barely likes the weather in Philadelphia. There's 1 year, Adams only served for 4 years. 1 year, he was in Quincy, Massachusetts for 7 months. He took a we sit here and complain about Donald Trump's and Barack Obama's golfing or George Bush going off to the ranch. That was nothing compared to John Adams. And, there's no email coming out from Quincy. His ministering to his presidency was a little shaky on that grounds. But anyway, he gets to Washington and he doesn't like, as they're starting to build there, he doesn't like the weather there either. And he says, John, I'm going back. It's your job. So, John Marshall is also the sort of the general contractor of Washington, and he's got to get it sort of ready to go before the next Congress comes in. And so he concentrates on building the White House and the Capitol. It's probable that John Marshall was the first person to sleep in the White House, because as it's being built and it gets enclosed, it's probably much more. He has to be there anyway, and because he doesn't have any offices in the Capitol, probably better than the average hotel that's staying at. So he does get it done in time. But another thing that happens is that the Supreme Court had 3 Chief Justices by this point. John Jay was the first one, and he was another writer of the Federalist Papers. And at some point, after the first session of the Supreme Court, the real first session, no cases were decided. There was one case that came in front of them, and it was decided outside. Well, excuse me, not no case. So no cases actually went to trial. So it's decided out of court. Washington sends Jay off to Britain to negotiate the secondary peace treaty, eventually called in England. Well, he's gone. We have no Supreme Court Chief Justice. Well, not in the United States anyway. And imagine this, imagine that Joe Biden calls John Robertson and says, you can do better than what we've been doing in Israel. Why don't you go over there and see what you can do? It's not what we think of as the government of the split powers. Well, then you'll go see that a similar thing happens to Marshall, in that the then current Supreme Court Chief Justice gets stuck in France because he's over there negotiating a treaty about the pirates in the Mediterranean, and he gets sick and he can't make it back on the next boat. So he resigns his office, he sends a note resigning his office, and Adams appoints Marshall Chief Justice. Well, this is great. He's Chief Justice and Secretary of State. Well, as you may know, if you're there's a thing that Jefferson eventually wins the 1800 election in February. It gets decided in Congress. His set to with Aaron Burr finally accedes to becoming vice president instead of challenging Jefferson Congress president. So now you have a situation that before March 4th, when Jefferson takes over, the Federalists still have the presidency and Congress. But when it turns over, Jefferson will be president and the Republican Democrats will have the Congress. So what Adams does is he starts appointing federal judges and federal judiciary members. So when Jefferson takes over, we talk about the 6-3 split in the current Supreme Court. Well, when Jefferson takes over, every judge in the United States is a Federalist, or at least appointed by a Federalist president, right? There are only 2 presidents. So we have more or less between district court and all, like 43 judges, all Federalists. So, but the Supreme Court isn't thought of as much when they make a room for it in the Capitol building. It's in the basement, and in a basement room that given the lack of buildings up in Washington, on Saturdays sometimes often it holds church services. So this is what we think of the Supreme Court at the time. But Marshall is sort of ingenious, and he sees this as his way of keeping federalism going and making the country run in a certain way, the way he would like it. So, Washington was our first president, and much of what the presidency became was what Washington did. Whatever he did, he dressed more informally sometimes. He didn't ask to be called Your Excellency. He was not going to have a hereditary presidency. A lot of these things come from what Washington does. Well, as time goes by, what the Supreme Court is what John Marshall says it is. Well, to get back to this for a moment, it's coming to March 4th, and the Secretary of State has to sign off on all these judgeships, and some of them, about 4 of them, don't get delivered on time. One of whom is a justice of the peace in Washington, D.C., New Washington, D.C., William Marbury. Now, Bill Marbury is an operator. He is a guy who always wants to have a job or something. He gets a little a job of doing the site finding for the new naval headquarters in Washington, the office building. And he realizes things are going to be a little shorter now because he's a Federalist. And even though it's just a justice of the peace job, he wants it. And so he sues for the commission. Now think about it. Who was signing all these commissions? John Marshall. When Bill Marbury takes his case to the Supreme Court, as he can because he's suing the federal government for his commission, Marshall has to decide this case that he influenced. That in any case, you would have to recuse yourself, it would seem, but he didn't. And but the Republicans decide, well, this case that my second cousin, Jefferson says, is trying to decide, we're not going to let him do it for a while. So they rewrite a judiciary law that says there won't be any Supreme Court in more months. Well, Marshall bides his time. He sees where things are going. But he starts getting the other justices. There are 6 total, so 5 other justices, and he just says that this is how we want things to be. First of all, when we're in session, which is not that much, as you know, there are 2 different sessions for a couple months apiece. We're all going to stay at the same hotel, and we're going to be the greatest kind of collegial bunch, because all our decisions are going to be unanimous. It's not quite unanimous, but we're going to speak as one voice. Even if we're just 4-2, it's going to be 4-2 the next time for somebody else, but we're going to speak as one voice, and I'm going to write most of the opinions. And he feels that that's the way to get some credence when you have 6, distinguished individuals act as a team. Well, the case finally comes up, and Marshall is famous in the end for writing decisions that give a sop to the other side, to the side that's not going to win the decision. And in this case, it's a convoluted case, but he says that based on the Judiciary Act of 1789, this appointment is fair, but we can't intercede. If Madison doesn't want Marbury, then he doesn't have to have. He doesn't have to deliver the commission. He is now the Secretary of State. We blew it by not getting it before, and it's now in his favor. But this whole law that set up the judiciary is invalid, and like I say, it's a convoluted reasoning, but he shows how judges are appointed and unfairly, and so we're invalidating this law. Well, that wasn't anything that anybody had thought of. It's not sitting there in the Constitution, but Marshall does this, and Jefferson accedes to it. So because he's got the thing he wants, that's these Marbury and these other 3 cats don't get their jobs, and but Marshall has now set the precedent of judicial review, and it's the first time the law has been struck down, first time an act of Congress has been invalidated. And if you go through the rest of Marshall's famous opinions, I'm going to give you the quick overview here. But McCulloch versus Maryland, are cases where either an individual is against the federal government is against the state government, 2 different state governments are against each other, and in each case, the idea of judicial review comes up, and the idea that the federal government holds more sway, that we're here to be a solid nation, not a bunch of states. In his mind, states, even though he's a Southerner, states' rights is fine when it's only the state doing something for itself. But when it's against an individual or the federal government or another state, that's not how we roll here. And so he continues as Supreme Court Chief Justice till 1835, and still writes most of these opinions on through these Democrat, Republican administrations, on through Madison, Monroe, Jackson, John Quincy Adams. He is the Supreme Court Chief Justice, and he, basically the law is what I say it is. So in between all his giving parties, he sets up the judiciary, and this is how we view it today. This is how things sort of go. He, on the other hand, he views himself as a regular guy. He rides a horse. He gets the commission for George Washington's biography, which is a disaster. The Washington family gives him the papers. He through a Philadelphia publisher, he's going to do something like Book of the Month Club, where there are 3 different volumes that are going to come out, hopefully in consecutive years, and people pay for this subscription. Well, he doesn't get the first volume out the first year, second year, the third year. Finally, it comes out, and what is it? But not a history, not a biography of George Washington. It's this first volume It's about the history of America before George Washington. People ask for their money back. You know, the Supreme Court Chief Justice is writing. John Adams, who loves Marshall, says it's perhaps the worst book ever written in American history. Well, at that point, American history didn't hold much, but in terms of years. But meanwhile, there's a guy selling. You know, he works for this company, this publishing company, and he's commissioned to sell these things. But he says, you know, I could do this better. And he goes to the publisher and tells him that he's going to write something that's sort of halfway between fact and fiction. And he's going to, you know, this is going to be a better George Washington biography. Well, the guy's name is Mason Weems, Parson Mason Weems. And he, from your childhood, you know, he wrote the cherry tree story. He wrote the George Washington's false teeth story. He wrote all these things that are quasi-true. Well, they aren't true, obviously, but to sell a point. And he sells 50,000 copies of this book. Now, remember how many people there are in America, 3 million people. 50,000 copies is a lot of copies. And, you know, it resonates down through today. Marshall's book eventually does get written. It's really turgid. He is not a good writer. You know, I love my subject, but this is not the best of tomes. So, in any case, he lives long enough to have a myth in Philadelphia about him, and that is when he dies, he dies because he has kidney stones, and he is ridden up from Richmond to Philadelphia to his favorite doctor with kidney stones. Can you imagine, you know, how many days he's on a horse? You know, anyway, he gets to Philly. He goes to Pennsylvania Hospital, the first hospital in the United States. He gets operated on. He's in pretty bad shape, and they call his sons to come. And one of his sons is coming up from Richmond. He gets to Baltimore. There's a great storm, and he tries to stay in this inn. A stone from the top of the inn falls on him, and he gets killed on his way to his father's deathbed. John never gets told of this. He also gets bled like Washington, and he dies. And when he dies, there's a myth that in among people that the Liberty Bell rang for the last time and it cracked. But the story is 0 for 3. The Liberty Bell didn't ring for, it was the State House bell in Philadelphia. It was up in the belfry. It really didn't ring for anything because it was already cracked. So they didn't really ring it. Sometimes they tapped it. And actually the Liberty Bell didn't become named the Liberty Bell until the abolitionists in Massachusetts named it that. It was just the State House bell. But later on, it did take circuits around the country through the early 20th and late 19th centuries. So, and people would tap it. So it wasn't rung for the last time. But when Marshall dies, there are only 2 people who you would call founders still alive, James Madison and Aaron Burr, but they had been long retired while Marshall was writing his Supreme Court decisions. Well, anyway, I've talked breathlessly. Does anybody out there have questions? Does anybody either in our hierarchy or our audience have any questions for me about history, about how you go through this sort of evolution and writing about it, trying to find out every last little fact about your guy?
Thank you, Robert. If you got any questions, use the chat feature down below. What brought you to this topic, and how long did it take you to research this? What made you gravitate to this guy?
Okay, so here's the story. So I wrote the Buchanan book because I love the idea of being the expert of something that nobody really wanted to be. Nobody was sitting there out there wanting to be the expert on James Buchanan, right? And I love the idea of a person who was essentially a failure and writing about how that sort of affected things. So since the book was successful, this is what happens. Your publisher says, well, pick out somebody else, you know? So the next guy I pick out is Henry Clay. I liked him, to write about him. And so the publisher says, well, nobody's ever written a successful biography of Henry Clay. And I say, James Buchanan, it's like, all right. But so I decided on Marshall because he was a significant figure. And when I started looking him up, and he had all these sort of little foibles and things along the way, I decided that that's who I wanted to write about. And in this book, there are about 6 or 7 other sort of side essays that on topics that I liked in American history, like who were the worst Supreme Court justices, when did the founding of the country really end, why do we study history anyway? But what is it about history that's worth doing? So I was able to sort of relate them to some parts of Marshall's life. Marshall was thought of as a compromise candidate in 1800, for instance. So I wrote about other people who almost became president: Jefferson Davis, William Jennings Bryan, Clay, people like that. So it was an easy way to get into writing about history. And my next book will be similarly American history again. I guess that's what I like to read now, and so I like to write it in a way that I hope people find entertaining.
Marshall obviously was known for judicial review, among other things. Is it, frankly, his lack of schooling and his lack of judiciary that led him to make some common sense decisions? I mean, we know that he and Jefferson did not see eye to eye. So I don't know if common sense decisions or is just a point of view, but and was it thinking on his feet or just trying to
well,
be a gadfly to Jefferson?
I never thought of it, but that may be part of it. I will say this, that it sort of runs against our core that a not formally educated person can write about formally educated things, like this. But one thing that held Marshall's interest, I think, is that he was in his 40s, of course, when he became Chief Justice, and he saw a path. He saw something where he could influence the government, where he could change things, where he could, essentially his early decisions saved the country because it was splitting up into these factions, and it needed a judiciary, it needed a Supreme Court that was influential, and that's what he saw. He saw a way to be that, and it's starting with judicial review, and most of the if you go to most of the cases that even today's Supreme Court looks at, the facts are almost off to the side. It's the principle that you want to get to. Cohen's versus Virginia is about betting on the lottery. But what it ends up being is how a state can't overrule a federal decision. It's not about these two guys in Maryland who are trying to sell a lottery in Virginia. That's like the barest bones of it, but it gives Marshall a chance to talk about that. So that's what he was good at, and I suppose that it's no different with John Roberts. He looks at several thousand possible cases, or they all do, that could come up before the court, and he sees maybe today he's interested in who knows what, some business angle or something. So he finds a case that will help him to make this decision. I can't tell you that that's what is in John Roberts's mind, but it was certainly in Marshall's mind.
Is there a favorite Marshall anecdote of yours? What one that makes him look good, one that makes him look bad? I hear that it really stuck out with you to kind of show who he was, what he was.
Okay, well, he does. It's like it'd be like me going up against Ohtani in a home run derby contest or something. He finds the best guy to beat in every case, and the best guy is Jefferson as well. The best guy is Talleyrand in Europe. But one of the other things of him is he's sort of like I say, a friendly guy, party giver. He in one of his races for the House of Burgesses, he sits in front of the Richmond courthouse and has one of these casks of Madeira, and his opponent has to go out and get another one just so that he can. So there's a lot of drunk people in this particular race. But the other thing is he founds a club in Richmond, and he, being his athletic self, he picks quoits as his game. So it's the Quoits Club. Now, so it is. One of the things about the Quoits Club is you can come in and play quoits and do whatever you want, but you can't talk politics. And once you talk politics, the professor, as they called Marshall, says you have to buy a case of champagne for the next party. So that was his deal. Is that there's time to talk politics and time to play quoits, or talk about your wife or whatever it is. So that's how I feel that he lived most of his life. And when you talk about being the common man, that's how he portrayed himself at the Supreme Court, even in its formality. When you go to the Supreme Court, there's a big statue of him, and there's his chairs there, and each new Supreme Court justice gets to sit in John Marshall's chair for their first day as a justice. So that's their big deal.
You mentioned your next book. What's on the docket for that, or have you?
I mean, the problem is that it isn't sold yet, but so I'm hoping that my proposal gets sold, and it is actually another topic that I've always been interested in. It's the Confederacy. Now I know I'm running into potential problems here, but I don't view it as that. I'm looking at it as history. But I want to write about the founders of the Confederacy, and the reason is this: this is a country, if we want to call it a country, that got put together in about 8 weeks from the time South Carolina secedes until they get all the rest of them down in Montgomery, and it lasts for about 4 years, and it gets a substantial army. I mean, it needed, but there were the interest to me is the precursor, of course, of these guys from the South, and who were the real smart people and who weren't the smart people. I don't want to turn it into a monument to somebody. I know better than that. But Jefferson Davis was could have been president of the United States. He just sort of didn't get it together to run at the right time. So who knows what that would have been. Anyway, so that's what I want to look at.
Good luck with that. Thank you very much for taking the time tonight. This was great. Good luck with this book, and continued success. It was great to see you again.
Thank you once again, and I'll be up there in person the next time.
All right, you got it. All right, thanks a lot, Robert. All right,
Okay,
thank you,
thank you, Brett.
everybody. Stay safe and watch the weather. It's clouding up here. All right.
All right.